Hello, everyone. We'll just take a few moments to finish admitting folks to this session. Thank you for being here. Grab yourself a glass of water, get comfortable. Be with you in just a moment. Great, thank you for joining us. Just a quick reminder to ensure you're on mute when you join us. And I think we're just about ready to start. We'll have some folks joining us a little bit late as well, but that's perfectly all right. So thank you everyone for joining us for our second Inclusion in Action Speaker Series event. This is our first of the year, but we had a full season last year. My name is David Pereira. I use he and they pronouns, and I am the acting director of the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office at the University of Toronto, and I'm delighted to be your MC for today. I have curly hair and a full beard, and I'm wearing clear framed glasses and a white collared shirt. I'm seated at my desk in the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office, and I have pride flags draped behind me. I'm pleased also to be joined today by my colleague who will introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, David, for that introduction. Hello, my name is Natasha. I use she and her pronouns, and I am an advisor at the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office at the University of Toronto. I have short black hair. I am wearing black glasses. I have a dark red sweater and a gold necklace, and I am your moderator for today's Q&A portion of the event.
Thank you. So before we start, please note that we have live captioning and ASL interpretation available. You'll see those on your screen, but there's also some instructions on how to access all of that. The live captions can be accessed in the Zoom menu by clicking the CC button or by clicking on the three dots to get to the More menu, then selecting Show Subtitles. And a special thank you to today's live captioner, Brooke, and ASL interpreters, Dean and Jonathan. We understand access to be a shared responsibility between everyone in this space. In addition to the live captions and ASL interpretation, we've strived to create an accessible space that proactively eliminates barriers to participation. We also welcome disability and the challenges that it brings. Is there anything about the virtual space that we should address now? Can we support any other access needs? I invite you to respond in the chat or to directly message Carmen Kamen, one of our event staff, or Entizar throughout the event if you need access. Some other considerations: if you would like to rename yourself, please feel free to do so. I believe that you can, so the Zoom chat will also be open if you want to post any comments throughout the event. If you need any assistance with the Zoom platform, please send a direct message to Entizar or Carmen. They are part of the event team, and they'll help with your request. That may also include renaming yourself in the platform. To begin or to continue, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'm joining today's conversation from Takaranto, also known as Toronto. This land is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, one of several wampum in the region. According to the website, A Treaty Guide for Torontonians, this wampum is, quote, widely cited and admired for the reciprocal responsibilities with all of creation that it foregrounds. A reading that draws on the land as a dish to be shared and cared for to ensure ongoing sustenance and life, a metaphor that is part of many Indigenous knowledge systems. For generations and generations, Indigenous people have diligently stewarded this land, yet will no doubt learn today that they and others have disproportionately been impacted by our actions, the actions of settler governments and corporations upon the land and our planet. My ancestors arrived to Turtle Island, today known as Canada, having stewarded the land in northern Portugal, farming and working the land to grow crops that sustained them for generations before them. My respect and zeal for the land and for the water, all they make possible, and for the nourishment that both provide, was instilled in me as a young boy. I am moved by the clarity of the dish with one spoon wampum covenant, one dish representing the land and one spoon representing the individuals living on and using the resources of the land in a spirit of mutual cooperation. As a settler, and like some of you perhaps, I know I have a responsibility to honor this covenant. I'm hopeful that today's talk can inspire me and perhaps many of us to better understand where and how we can do more to fulfill these responsibilities and share the resources of the land in a spirit of mutual cooperation. So we are mindful of security concerns while using this platform. If there are any major disruptions that interrupt the host's ability to keep control of the Zoom platform, a member from our organizing team will ask everyone to log off immediately and the session will be adjourned. We will send appropriate follow-up communication if needed. If there are any inappropriate verbal or written communication in the chat, individuals will be removed immediately. We are asking that we as a community hold each other accountable for maintaining a space of safety, accountability, respect, and inclusion, and let us work together to have an enjoyable and informative session. Thank you. I will now provide some very brief context for today's session. Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and marginalized communities are disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis resulting from the greater exposure to environmental racism in the form of pollution and contamination from nearby industry, as well as their residents in regions where they are more likely to be impacted by rising sea levels, disappearing shorelines, frequent and heavy rainfall, raging storms and floods, intense heat waves, increasing wildfire and poor air quality that hit them first and worst. I would like to now pass it over to my colleague Natasha from the Anti-Racism Cultural Diversity Office to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much for that, David. Now I have the honor of introducing today's keynote speaker, Dr. Ingrid Waldron. In this presentation, Dr. Waldron will discuss the relationship between environmental racism and climate change inequities and their impacts on Indigenous, Black, and other marginalized communities in Canada. She will examine Canada's role in creating and maintaining environmental racism and climate change inequities by highlighting how the relationship between these both are rooted in place or geography, slavery and colonialism, and a legacy of structural inequities in these communities. Using environmental and climate justice frameworks that are premised on justice, human rights, and civil rights, Dr. Waldron will discuss how she has been addressing environmental racism and climate change impacts through her organizations, as well as the role of government, institutions of higher education, and the public in addressing these issues. For more information on the work of Dr. Waldron, we invite you to visit the event webpage to read the full bio for our speaker for today. I'm looking forward to hearing from Dr. Waldron's presentation, and please note that there will be a chance to ask questions at the end. I'd like to welcome to the space, Dr. Waldron.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Let me just pull up my slides. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to talk about kind of the journey that I've taken to address both environmental racism and climate change, but I wanted to just kind of outline some of the learning objectives for my talk today. So the first thing I want to do is to define environmental racism and understand examples of environmental racism within the Canadian context, because I still think that the term confuses a lot of people. It's gotten better over the years. People understand the term, but I always include in my presentation a definition that comes from community, and then a more academic definition of environmental racism. I also want to connect contemporary examples of environmental racism to colonization of North America, the transatlantic slave trade as well. And third, to build skills to identify patterns and processes of environmental racism and their connections to current environmental crises and disasters. Also to reflect on the role of post-secondary institutions in issues of environmental racism, to consider policies and actions that can challenge the impacts of environmental racism and advance climate justice at institutional and interpersonal levels. So the intersection of climate injustice and environmental racism, two terms that I think are used interchangeably. So I think at times there's confusion about environmental racism, whether it's climate change or environmental, they're just often used interchangeably by individuals who speak to me about the issue, or often people who invite me to do talks, they mention climate justice, but then asked me to do a presentation on environmental racism. So I just think there's some confusion around the terms. So I want to kind of define the terms, but also talk about the intersections, because although they are independent, separate concepts, no doubt they are connected. So the intersection of climate injustice and environmental racism, both concepts, so climate justice first is both a concept and a movement that recognizes that different communities will be impacted differently and unequally by climate change based on issues of identity, issues like race, socioeconomic status, social class, gender identity, age, disability, sexuality, and geographic location, and other social identities and factors. The climate justice framework highlights the fact that Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and marginalized communities in the global North and South are disproportionately vulnerable to the climate crisis because they are more likely to be exposed to pollution and contamination from nearby industry. So when I talk about pollution, contamination, that's environmental racism, and reside in places where they are also more likely to be impacted by rising sea levels, disappearing shorelines, frequent and heavy rainfall, raging storms and floods, intense heat waves, increasing wildfire, poor air quality, higher rates of climate-related diseases, and other effects of climate change that hit them first and worst. In addition, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized and marginalized communities are at greater risk for climate disasters because they're more likely to experience long-standing structural inequities that make it much more difficult for them to escape, survive, and recover from these disasters. These long-standing structural inequities include racist and discriminatory policies and practices within our social structures, such as residential segregation, unequal educational opportunities, limited opportunities for economic advancement, low income and poverty, and fragile public infrastructure, such as poor quality housing, and streets and roads that are not properly built, or for some communities, communities that don't have sidewalks. So I know a few communities that don't have sidewalks, and sidewalks certainly are important. They're also considered to be a health issue when we think of public infrastructure and the determinants of health. When we trace the climate crisis back to slavery and colonialism, it becomes clear that climate change arose out of a legacy of extraction that disproportionately impacted Black and Indigenous people, and that consequently is inextricably linked to a legacy of environmental racism in these communities. These factors have increased the vulnerability of Black and Indigenous people to the climate crisis and other global crises. Therefore, the fights against climate change, environmental racism, and racial injustice are considerably intertwined and must be addressed together. So here's James Desmond, an environmental activist I met when I was living and teaching in Nova Scotia. He's from the African Nova Scotian community of Lincolnville. And I always use this quote from James because I think it's succinct, it's clear, it seems simple, it is simple, but it's extremely layered. And it's very short, but it encompasses some of the main tenets of environmental racism. So this is from a 2013 workshop. A year after I started my Enrich project, my environmental racism project, I decided to drive down to the communities that were impacted. I drove down to James's community, as I said, Lincolnville, and we got this on film. We shot a short 20-minute documentary called In Whose Backyard? And this is the definition he gave us when we asked for the definition of environmental racism. He says that the practice has been locating industrial waste sites next to African Nova Scotian Native and poor white communities, communities that don't have a base to fight back. You ask if that's environmental racism, it's environmental racism to its core. Here's the more academic definition of environmental racism that comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who is considered to be the father of environmental justice. He started doing his work in the very early 1990s. He's currently teaching in Texas, and I had the privilege of having him come up to Halifax for a symposium that I organized in 2017. So he's one of my heroes. So this is how he defines environmental racism. And you'll notice that it's very, very similar to James Desmond's very, very short and succinct definition. It encompasses all of the basic tenets of environmental racism that was shared by James Desmond. So environmental racism, I would say primarily, is about the disproportionate siting or location of toxic industries in primarily Indigenous and Black and other racialized communities in the United States, also Hispanic communities. So I would say that the main definition of environmental racism is about disproportionality, the fact that that industry is placed in communities that are racialized, low income, and in many cases also isolated communities, communities that are out of the way. So on reserve in the case of Indigenous communities, and in isolated communities, as is the case in Nova Scotia, where most of the African Nova Scotian communities live in isolated places, unlike other parts of Canada. I would call them rural or semi-rural areas. It's also about the lack of political power that these communities have for resisting the placement of these toxic industries in their communities. So as James Desmond mentioned, he said they don't have the power or the clout in many ways to resist. Well, they certainly resist. So they engage in activism and advocacy, but they're often not heard. And that has everything to do, of course, with the fact that they are racialized, they are low income, they live in these isolated places. So it's very difficult for them to get heard but by government. They lack often the social, economic, and political clout to be seen as people who are important or worthy in many ways to be heard and for action to be taken. Environmental racism is also about the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening presence of poisons in their communities. So in other words, environmental racism just doesn't happen. When we see the spatial segregation of industries in certain communities, it's about policy. Just like any form of discrimination, it comes out of policy. In the case of environmental racism, it's about environmental policy. So in many ways, racism is inscribed within policy, and we have to look at who gets to make policy, who gets to make decisions. It's certainly not the communities that are most impacted, right? When we look at environmental departments of environment and other decision-making boards, they're making policies that are often harmful to communities. And it's very systemic, it's very subtle, but there's also, part of it is also, I don't want to harm my community, because there's very much an us and them ideology in terms of where we place these industries. So it's a protection of our community So it's much easier to put it in other communities because you may believe that these industries are harmful in some way. So it's really about policy, environmental policy, when we look at where these industries are placed across Canada. It's also about the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup. So we also have to ask why it takes so long for some communities to get action. And I think specifically about a community that I will talk about briefly later, Pictou Landing First Nation and Boat Harbor. Boat Harbor is a contaminated site in Pictou Landing First Nation. And they've had a mill dumping effluent into Boat Harbor since 1967. The community got very active in the 1980s, but it was not until January 31st, 2020, that the mill closed finally and action was taken. So environmental racism is also about the fact that racialized communities, it takes much longer for them to be heard, as I said, and much longer for them to get action. Just 1 minute, please. Hello? Hello? Sorry about that, I'm at home, so a few disruptions. Yeah, so it's about why certain communities, racialized communities, get action, or it takes much longer for government to act on their concerns. That's another aspect of environmental racism. And finally, the other aspect of environmental racism is exclusion. We often talk about having a seat at the table. And the communities that are most impacted, Indigenous, Black, other racialized communities, often do not have a seat at the table. So when we think about, once again, departments of environment, ENGOs, regulatory bodies, commissions, any kind of organization that makes decisions about environmental racism, the communities that are impacted are not invited to the table. So that exclusion, I think, allows environmental racism to manifest over time when you don't have the opportunity to hear from or get the perspectives of the people who are most impacted. Then that never gets into policy. Their suggestions, their recommendations, their opinions, their lived experiences never inform policy and decision making. And I think that's one reason we see environmental racism manifesting intergenerationally. So I wrote a book on environmental racism. It was in 2018 that it was released, and I was thinking about what I thought to be a solid theory that can explain or articulate environmental racism, and I came upon settler colonial theory just kind of a little bit before I wrote my book. I was attending a lot of events, environmental racism events, to think through environmental racism specifically for my book. And I just noticed in Nova Scotia, a lot of people were talking about settler colonial theory and neoliberalism. And, these just seemed to be popular theories at that time. And I looked a little bit more into it and I thought this is perfect. Perfect for me to articulate how environmental racism happens, how it manifests, how it operates. So I want to talk a little bit about settler colonial theory, because I think environmental racism is a really great example of it. And because it has been enabled by enslavement of African peoples and Indigenous dispossession, both of which are foundational to Canada's legacy and wealth. So new opportunities for Europeans to accumulate wealth, as well as their creation of a global economy that was eventually dominated by Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and Britain, prompted European colonization in North America. Veracini, a leading theorist on the topic of settler colonialism, distinguishes, however, between colonialism and settler colonialism. And he notes that colonialism describes the late 19th century European conquest and colonization of Africa and Asia, which is characterized by uneven structural power between areas of a nation state, as well as unequal social relations, exploitation, and enslavement for the purposes of creating technological progress and improved infrastructure, among other factors. Settler colonialism, on the other hand, describes contemporary forms of colonialism in British-descended settler colonies, such as Canada, the United States, Australia, focusing specifically on the elimination of Indigenous people and their relationships from and with the land. Whereas in the colonial states, the colonizers go out to the colonies and then return home in a circular movement. There is no return home in the case of settler colonialism. The transformation of the new colony into home is settler colonialism's main goal, one that is premised on profit seeking through land acquisition, resource extraction, and exploitation. So I hope that kind of provides a distinction between the two. You know, in settler colonialism, people, the colonizers per se stay, and they're turning the new colony into home, and there's no movement back home to Europe in any sense. But the goal is the same as in colonialism, which is dispossession, exploitation, extraction. So I want to provide a few case studies of environmental racism across Canada, beginning with Nova Scotia, because that is where I began my work. And I would say, just as far as I know, dates back to environmental racism, dates back to maybe the early 1940s. I'm going to talk about Shelburne later, but a dump was placed in Shelburne in the early 40s. So we're going way back. So this is Sabaganagadi First Nation. And between 2014 and 2021, Sabaganagadi First Nation opposed the development of a brine discharge pipeline by Alton Gas near the Shubenacadie River in Nova Scotia. I'll talk later about what subsequently happened. Here I speak to Landing First Nation. I mentioned this community earlier, and I talked about Boat Harbor. So between 1967 and 2020, Northern Pulp Mill had been dumping effluent into Boat Harbor in Pictou Landing First Nation, Nova Scotia, which the community, unlike many communities, says is connected to high rates of cancer and respiratory illness in their community. Here we have Amjinwang First Nation. So this is one of the, I would say, one of the worst cases of environmental racism in Canada. It's in Ontario, near Sarnia, Ontario, often referred to as Chemical Valley. And this is a community that, which I think is quite stunning, is that it's a community that is surrounded by over 60 petrochemical facilities within a 25 square kilometer area, which the community also says, similar to other communities, is linked to high rates of cancer they see in the community, reproductive illness, and other health issues. You probably also heard of Grassy Narrows First Nation near Kenora, Ontario. So they have long been concerned about the health effects of mercury contamination in the Wabigoon English River near their community. During the 1960s and 1970s, the chemical plant at the Reed paper mill dumped 9,000 kilograms of mercury into the river. It's estimated that 90% of the population in Grassy Narrows have symptoms of mercury poisoning. And these symptoms include neurological problems ranging from numbness in the fingers and toes to seizures and cognitive delays, even though the mercury entered the food chain decades ago. So there was a CBC article, I think it was in April of last year or the year before, where community members talked about the health issues that they are suffering from now, even though, as I said, the mercury was dumped way back in the 60s and 70s. And so many of them have, maybe less serious health issues to very, very serious health issues, like, as I said, cognitive delays and neurological issues. A community, Indigenous community, or a case of environmental racism that I guess gets lots of attention today is Wet'suwet'en First Nations. And over the past few years, mass demonstrations, sit-ins, and blockades have gripped parts of Canada over the movement to support the leaders of Wet'suwet'en First Nation, who are opposed to a multi-billion-dollar pipeline project that is being developed near their community. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are Black communities that are also impacted by environmental racism. I think most people don't really connect Black communities to environmental racism, but I found in Nova Scotia there were quite a few cases. And I've always wondered why there's so many cases in the Black community in Nova Scotia, perhaps more so than other Black Canadian communities. I'm not really sure, but I also think that the isolated community factor has a lot to do with it. I mentioned earlier that, you know, when you are racialized, you're low income, but you also live in isolated, out of the way communities, you're often forgotten. We can understand that when we think about Indigenous reserves, but we can also understand it when we think of historic African Nova Scotian communities, most of which are located in rural or semi-rural areas. So the only urban African Nova Scotian community I'm aware of is the north end of Halifax, where many of the folks from Africville, which you see on the screen here, was pushed out and moved to the north end of Halifax. But most African communities, historic African Nova Scotian communities, of which there are about 50, live in these rural, semi-rural areas. So I think that might play a role in why they seem to be, they have in the past faced environmental racism, because they're often, as I said, forgotten communities and seen as having less power to fight back. So Africville, I always say, is an example of both environmental racism and gentrification, or what we often refer to as urban renewal. So the city of Halifax wanted to engage in a kind of urban renewal campaign in the late 1960s. But in the midst of that urban renewal, in the midst of gentrification, the community was pushed out. But what was also left behind were a number of environmental and social hazards. Those hazards, environmental hazards, included a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Here's Lincolnville. So you met James Desmond earlier, the photo of James Desmond where he was defining environmental racism. This is his community of Lincolnville. And this is a photo that my research assistant took in 2013 when, as I said, we visited the community. So African Nova Scotians in Lincolnville have been exposed to a first and second generation landfill. The first generation landfill was placed there in 1974 and the second generation landfill in 2006. Just when the community was a bit hopeful, I think, that the first generation landfill would be redirected or relocated, there was a bit of a slap in the face when the second generation landfill was put on top of the first generation landfill in 2006. Like other communities, they believe strongly that increasing rates of cancer, respiratory illness, etc., is due to the landfill, the first generation landfill and the second generation landfill. Here is Shelburne. So Shelburne is another African Nova Scotian community. You've got the north end of Shelburne and also the south end of Shelburne. The north end of Shelburne is disproportionately white, and the south end of Shelburne is disproportionately African Nova Scotian. And I mentioned that I would say that cases of environmental racism in Canada may have started around 1943, because in Shelburne, the dump was placed there in 1943, in and around there. And the community members would say everything and anything went into that dump. Now, in Lincolnville that I showed earlier, that's considered to be a landfill. In Shelburne, it's considered to be a dump. And I believe that how you distinguish a dump from a landfill is the fact that a landfill will have a liner. A landfill has a liner and a dump does not. So what you see here is the dump in Shelburne. And some great things have happened since I first met the community that I'll talk about later. Toronto, specifically racialized and immigrant communities are also exposed to various environmental hazards. So in the Greater Toronto area, air pollution is concentrated in highly racialized areas like Scarborough and Etobicoke North. For example, the notorious case of the McClure radioactive site in Scarborough led a group of immigrant citizens who had been given radioactive land without warning into a decade-long legal battle with the Ontario government, and they eventually won their case. And that case is documented in a book by the author named Heightenton. So there's a lot of cases, and certainly, over the years, I've tried to address some of them, primarily in Nova Scotia, because that's where I was situated. And in 2012, I developed the Enrich project, kind of on the request of an environmental activist who visited me in my office and asked me to take on a project on environmental racism, and I never heard of the terms, and I didn't know why he had approached me, because I had never done anything around the environment. Well, I do know. I think some folks at the health center in the North End asked him whether or not he had heard of me. He said he hadn't. And they said, well, Ingrid might want to take it on. So why don't you, hold a meeting with her? So he came to my office. He talked about environmental racism. He defined it. And I just thought it was a strange term. I was hesitant to take it on, mostly because the environmental aspect of it maybe concerned me. I didn't think I had the experience. I wasn't an environmental scientist. I was a sociologist. I am a sociologist, and I didn't know anything about the environment. I was attracted to the fact that I immediately understood it was a health issue, and it was an opportunity to work with African, Nova Scotian, and Indigenous communities. So those are aspects of it that I really liked. But I was really, I have to be honest, I was afraid of this project, because I thought somebody's going to find me out, that I wasn't the right person to do this. Those anxieties kind of decreased over the years when I realized I had something else to bring to it. Maybe I didn't have an environmental science degree, but I had something else to bring to it. So what this project ended up being was very multidisciplinary, very interdisciplinary, very intersectional, very multi-method. So in the beginning, I was open to the fact that I would use any method. I would speak with various people from various fields in order to address this issue. And what I've realized over the past, I guess now it's been 12 years, is that environmental racism as a topic is extremely interdisciplinary. It brings a lot of different people together, and that the solution to environmental racism should also be interdisciplinary and intersectional. One of the things I wanted to do first was raise awareness, because just like I was kind of surprised, I guess, confused by the term environmental racism. I just didn't understand what it meant. It seemed like a weird term. I found that a lot of people in Nova Scotia felt the same way, and I didn't blame them. Journalists that I spoke to constantly wanted to understand what it was. People told me they had never heard of the term. I think some people thought I created the term. It was actually created by Reverend Benjamin Chavez in the early 1980s, so not created by myself. So I thought, well, in order to get people to be a little bit empathic and understanding about this topic, and then consequently take action on it, you have to raise awareness. If people don't understand a topic, they're not going to take action on it. And I've seen over the years that as I've raised awareness about the topic, people are much more empathic about the issue and do take action. I can see the line where that has happened. So I spent a lot of time in Nova Scotia just putting on a lot of different events, workshops, community workshops, speaking at, of course, academic conferences, putting on public symposiums, film screenings, and other public engagement events in Canada and more broadly, just to create awareness about the issue. Part of creating awareness is also multimedia, of course. It's my understanding, of course, and everybody understands that people want to receive information in very different ways. We don't all want to read a book perhaps on the topic. We don't all want to read a journal article, but we want to receive information perhaps in more creative ways or ways that are accessible. And one of the ways I try to do that is through mapping, GIS, using GIS analysis to map environmental racism cases in Nova Scotia. So I think, at the time, maybe around 2016, I was getting maybe a few emails doubting what I was doing. And a comment made by somebody in the Chronicle Herald, the newspaper in Halifax, saying, what is Dr. Waldron? Dr. Waldron is crazy. Is she crazy? Environmental racism, is she serious? And what next is she going to talk about? Is she going to talk about environmental sexism next? Like, basically his comment was I was crazy, and this is a non-issue. And I mentioned that to one of my research assistants, and he said, well, why don't we just map it? Because he happened to be a health geography student. He said, just map it. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, sometimes when you map things and people see it visually, it's really, really strong evidence. And he was right, actually, because he created this map. There are two layers. You're seeing a flat map on the screen, but if you go to my website, you will see two layers, one for Mi'kmaq or Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia, and another map for African Nova Scotian communities. And what he did was he showed the proximity of the two communities to landfills, dumps, incinerators, pulp and paper mills. And of course, the evidence is very clear. And then when this was published in Canadian Geographic and also on CBC, I received some emails from folks saying, oh, I can see it now. There was some kind of legitimacy now about the work because they had seen it on a map. And a lot of professors, various professors at Dalhousie were telling me that they were using the map in their classroom. So I think, of course, the mapping gave some legitimacy to the work. And I know I've spoken to GIS experts since then, and they were like, yes, Ingrid, of course, when you put things on a map, it's strong evidence. You've got your data and your interviews and your focus groups and all of that. But when you put information on a map, people tend to believe it. Multimedia has also included something, obviously very exciting, which is a documentary that Canadian-born actor Elliot Page produced for my project, based on my book. So this was very exciting. It still is exciting. I went on to Twitter one day and noticed someone following me, someone new, didn't really think much of it, saw the name, but didn't think much of it. It didn't click that this was the Canadian-born actor. And then I returned to the Twitter page about 4 weeks later, and I was like, is this Elliot Page, the actor that I saw in Juno and X-Men and what's the other one with Leonardo DiCaprio? And I said, I guess it was. And I just didn't understand why he was reaching out to me. I had no idea he was an activist of any kind, and why was he interested in environmental racism. I learned later that he had read the book called The Mill by Joan Baxter, who is a Nova Scotian journalist. And she had put out a book called The Mill based on Pictou Landing First Nation, which I discussed earlier. And through that book, Elliot discovered my book. So Elliot was promoting my book on Twitter, promoting the Enrich Project, supporting the individuals on the front lines of environmental justice organizing. And that was happening for quite a while, and it just didn't click for me. And then it did click. And then I reached out to him, I DM'd him, and I thanked him. And then his friend, who is a restaurant owner in Nova Scotia, I had been speaking with her. We were on a committee together, and she said, oh, I've known Elliot for like 15 years. Do you want me to connect you? And I said, yes, please do. So at the end of 2018, it was a week of Christmas, we had a 3-way call. And it was just Elliot trying to figure out how he could use his celebrity, his platform, to support this work. In 2019, in January, we had a second call, this time with some of the women from Sabaganagati First Nation, and we had decided on maybe some 10-minute clips. We had no idea it was going to turn into a documentary that was 70 minutes, that would go to the Toronto International Film Festival. We were thinking simple. A few 10-minute clips, slap it onto Twitter, and create that awareness that I thought that this topic so needed at the time. But eventually we decided, because I actually suggested that we make it into a feature-length film, and I convinced them that that's what we needed to do, because I said, if we are trying to create awareness about environmental racism, the best thing to do is to create a film. And we rushed it before the submission date to the Toronto International Film Festival. We got in, and here you see us at the Elgin Theatre in Toronto on September 9th. Yes, I remember the date. September 9th, 2019, we had premiered the film there. And at the same time, Elliot's publicists had set up a lot of interviews with media. This was really exciting for me as a scholar. This is kind of what we want. This is knowledge mobilization to the T, the highest form. So we spoke with the Los Angeles Times, Time Magazine, Rolling Stone Magazine, Entertainment Weekly. Then we were on television, so Entertainment Tonight Canada and other television shows. So it's just a really perfect scenario for a scholar, where you've got your book, you get a documentary created based on your book. Then you get a premiere of your documentary at, to me, the most important film festival in the world, Toronto International Film Festival. And then in addition to that, you run around speaking to different media outlets. I mean, this was a really exciting time for me. And to be honest, I still don't know what happened. I don't know how this happened or why. But I'm grateful for it because a lot of great things happened later. One of the great things that happened later was Netflix. I had kind of known at the time when we were discussing the documentary and TIFF that it may go to Netflix, but it wasn't confirmed. At that time, Elliot had started on that Netflix show. What is it called? The Netflix show that he's on, The Umbrella Academy. So he had a deal with Netflix, and I thought that might help our film in terms of getting onto Netflix, and it probably did. He was probably able to get into the room. They did tell us at the time that it wasn't the type of documentary they typically feature on Netflix. And actually, to this day, I don't know what they mean. I should probably find that out. So it's not the typical documentary they feature, but they agreed to feature it. And it started streaming on Netflix, I think it was March 29th of 2020, just like a few days after COVID hit. So this is the time people were watching a lot of TV, I guess. Yeah, so this has been thrilling because Netflix goes around the world. So does TIFF in many ways. With TIFF, you've got people coming around the world. But when Netflix happened, I got so many calls from people around the world, congratulating me on the film, but also saying, I'm a bit surprised. I thought Canada was, a place of justice, a beacon of light, and I can't believe this is happening in Canada. Or I got, people from Nova Scotia saying, thank you for sharing this information. I live in Nova Scotia and I had no idea this was happening. So, and then, in many cases, the next words that came out of their mouths were, how can I help? And those are the magic words, and that's the power of media. And that's why I'm so happy that this has all happened, because while it's exciting to have, your first book be turned into a documentary and then be screened at TIFF and then go to Netflix, but it's much more satisfying when people say, how can I help? Because it shows the power of film and the fact that people now want to say, how can I help? Please connect me to the community members you've been working with. And from 2020 and onwards, that has happened. And I've connected them with many of the communities I featured earlier in this presentation. In terms of, wanting to share information in different and creative ways, this is kind of one of my favorite events that I held. This was in the midst of COVID. This event happened in November of 2020. So in Halifax, probably just like in Toronto, they have an annual art at night festival. It's called Nocturne. And you walk around, of course, the streets of Halifax, and there's different art showings and exhibits. Because it was the height of COVID, there was a decision to take Nocturne online on Zoom. And they had hired an Indigenous woman to curate the festival in general. And and I didn't know her, never met her, but she reached out to me and she said, I'd love if you can do something around environmental racism. And I came up with the idea of pairing activists with artists. The artists included musicians, singers, dancers, multimedia artists, and spoken word poets. And I chose activists like Irvin Carvery from Africville, that you see him with a hat on all the way to the right on the screen. In the blue, you see Doreen Bernard, who is from Sabaganagati First Nation. I talked about her earlier. On top of her, right there in the dark blue, is Michelle Francis Denny from Pictou Landing First Nation. And then there on the right, on the left in blue, is Vanessa Hartley from Shelburne. So each of them had 5 minutes to share their story about how environmental racism had impacted their community. And then following them right after would be an artist expressing the story of environmental racism in that particular community through dance, through spoken word, through music, through singing. This was a really successful event. The people online, there were a lot of people online, and it was impactful for them. And one of my favorite, if not my favorite events, because we were able to do that on Zoom. when we were all learning about Zoom, and it worked surprisingly, because something like this is certainly fit for, in-person viewing when you have artists and dancers, but somehow it worked. So it's once again a way for me to share this information in different and creative ways, understanding that people want to receive information in different ways. And I continue to use kind of media in different ways, whether it's art, social media, traditional media. I still think environmental racism is something that a lot of people are not aware of. And once again, awareness results, and I've seen it in my work, awareness results in action. People often say, okay, I get it now. Can you tell me how I can help? So I continue to speak with television, radio, podcasts, magazines, newspaper interviews, etc. Not as much as before, perhaps, because it can get very tiring, and often journalists, for example, want to speak to you right now. They don't care whether you're busy or they want to speak to you right now. They call you on Tuesday, and they want to speak to you now on Tuesday. So I can't do that really anymore because I'm so busy, but I understand the power of media. Not every academic probably likes media because, they take words out of context perhaps at times. And I would say that it's been positive for me 95% of the time. Of course, as an academic, I have to do research, and I've done a lot of research over the years. A lot of community-based research, making sure that I'm engaging community in ethically appropriate ways, and making sure that I give communities the tools to lead the research, which is what community-based research is about. Typically, as academics, we feel that we need to do everything from developing the research questions and the objectives to the methodology. With community engaged research, you want some leadership among community members. What you see here is an example of community-based research that I'm doing with other faculty at Dalhousie and McMaster. This is a photo from a town hall that we organized in August of this year. We went to the south end of Shelburne. I talked about this community before, to introduce ourselves to the community, but also to share what we were going to be doing. And this is a project that's looking at the very, very high rates of cancer in Shelburne. They have high rates of multiple myeloma, which is a blood cancer. So the team of researchers just spoke, just shared some of the things that we were going to do, including focus groups interviews, but also biospecimen sampling, where we are taking their blood because we want to find out the kind of causal factors for high cancer rates. So what we're looking at include four issues. Is the dump responsible for high rates of cancer? Is lifestyle responsible? Lifestyle such as smoking, diet, exercise? Are the social determinants of health responsible? Social determinants like race, gender, class, etc. And what else? Are genetics responsible? African ancestry in some way responsible? So we're looking at those four issues to determine which one, or maybe there's more than one, maybe it's all of them, maybe it's none of them, maybe it's some of them, like what's causing the high rates of cancer. So this is a really exciting study for me because the team is extremely multidisciplinary. Got a biologist, somebody in medicine, we've got a nurse, we've got a statistician, we've got somebody who's an architect / planner. There's myself, a sociologist, very multidisciplinary, probably the most multidisciplinary study that I've done. Of course, as an academic, I have to publish. And as I mentioned, my first book came out. This is the book that the documentary is based on, came out in 2018 in April. There's Something in the Water, traces my journey of conducting the Enrich project, doing the project on environmental racism, the challenges that I experienced doing community-based research, the challenges the communities have experienced, the victories that the communities have experienced. Chapter 5 is about health, the health effects, and trying to get maybe even environmental scientists thinking differently about health and the importance of including issues of health in their work. This came very easily to me for some reason writing this book, because I was actually using a journal to document everything I was doing, and that journal was for the purposes of putting out a monthly newsletter to my email subscribers. So, I put out a monthly newsletter, kind of letting them know what I was up to, precisely because it's community-based research. I wanted people to know I'm doing the work. I'm not just sitting around, I'm doing the work. So I would send out to my email subscribers, updates, news items, every month, and I was documenting it in writing. So when it came time to write this book, which I didn't actually want to write, the publisher came to me. We had coffee at Starbucks in 2015 around Easter. And he said to me, I want you to write this book. And I said to him, I'm not really ready to write a book. I really prefer to focus on journal articles because of the stage I was at in my career. And I think in sociology as well, I think journal articles are maybe privileged over books. You'd have to get those journal articles out in order to think about, going to the next stage. And I thought about it and I thought, oh, writing a book might be fun. I thought, oh, having my name on a front cover of a book, seeing it in a store, that's fun. So I agreed to do it, but it wasn't really something that I wanted to do. But it was fun writing it. And as I said, it wasn't really difficult because I had been documenting what I was doing since 2012. Let's see. Oh, I'm going backwards, sorry. I also think that when you work with marginalized communities, well, I know that it's not about going and taking from them. It's about developing real relationships. It's about remaining there in a way or sustaining those relationships, not disappearing. And one of the ways I wanted to do that was through community capacity building. It's about developing their skills. So you come into the community and often you have the skills, yes, but they have the knowledge in their community. They have knowledge about their community more than anybody else. What I have is maybe privilege, you can say, because I'm at a university, teaching at a university with all these networks of people who are in environmental science and planning. I have great networks. And also through my work, I have networks with government and I have grants, I have money, right? So I have a lot of privilege, but what you want to do is support communities through that privilege, through the grants and through the networks by sharing the networks you have. And this is exactly what I wanted to do. But you want to get the communities at a place where they don't really need you anymore. I always say that the communities should be empowered enough to be able to navigate the work that they need to do and to be able to fly without needing to hold your hands. And that to me is the purpose of a community engaged research, but also community capacity building, developing their skills so they have knowledge in particular areas. And one of the ways that I wanted to do this was through water testing. A hydrogeologist reached out to me. He had gone to one of my events and he said, I loved your event last night. And I love the fact that you're doing legislation. That's really important. But have you ever thought of giving the communities you're working with a win? I said, what do you mean by a win? He said, well, something practical, tangible that they could hold on to that would keep them there. And I said, well, what are you thinking of? And he said, well, why don't you test their water? You mentioned in the event, you talked about water contamination. I said, well, I have no idea how to test water and I'm a sociologist and that's just not what some of us do. He said, well, I'm a hydrogeologist and I can help. Why don't we form a working group, which we did. I mean, I was a bit put off by him, I have to say, as he walked into my office, all brash and everything, telling me what I needed to do because I felt I was doing a lot already. But I'm very, very happy that I listened to him. And mentally, I said to myself in my head, I said, just shut up, Ingrid, shut up. And just listen to this man who's coming across as very, very brash and arrogant. And I said, just listen. And I'm so happy I listened. I mean, we're friends now, even, I'm still connected to him, even though he's in Nova Scotia. And, if there's an opportunity, I will send it to him. If there's an opportunity, he will send it to me because I'm so proud of this project. We did water testing projects at no cost to the communities in Lincolnville and Shelburne in 2016 and 2018. And for the first time, these communities learned about what's in their water for the very first time. They always wanted to know, that was a priority issue, but they did not want the government to do that because they assumed the government would say, everything is okay, everything is fine. And I didn't have a dog in the fight, really, right? Why would I lie to them? So we put together this team and we tested the water at no cost. It was a team of an environmental science professor at the Nova Scotia Community College. As I mentioned, this man who's a hydrogeologist, an environmental science student, I believe at University of Waterloo, another environmental science student, and we just kind of met and we talked about how can we roll out this project. And the environmental science professor used his lab, once again, no cost, a lot of hours, testing the water. Then we wrote a final report. We went back to the community, we shared the findings, but we also continued to go back to the community to educate them about how to manage your drinking water supply. And we realized that it really, it was so successful that we needed to turn this into something more. It was a blueprint. It was a blueprint for an NGO that we wanted to form, that we did form, called Rural Water Watch. And that's, you see that on the screen, that's our logo. So in 2017, we realized the project was successful. We needed to turn this into something like an NGO, and we did. And right now it's still going, even though I'm no longer in Nova Scotia, I'm still kind of very invested in it. What this organization does is they do water testing in rural Nova Scotian communities. Don't have to be Indigenous or Black, any rural Nova Scotian community, because in general, rural communities tend to be, I believe, I'm not an expert, but on well water and not on municipal water. And municipal water is what we consider clean water, I guess, and well water is much more contaminated. So that's what we focus on. And also developing the skills of community members to test their own water, as well as training students, most of whom have been environmental science students, training students to lead water testing projects. So I'm really proud of this because it's tangible, it's practical, it's giving communities something much more immediate. And since 2018, the organization started holding Healthy Wells Day, where we educate community members about the need to keep your well healthy, because a lot of people have cracked wells or wells that are 20 years old. That's a health risk, right? So Healthy Wells Day, what we do is we do it online and we do it in person. Online, there are infographics, posters, facts and figures, statistics about wells. And then offline, we choose 4 communities and we ask them to bring in their water. On this one day, they all bring in their water, we test it, and we provide the results, and we go back to the communities. So it's a really great project. I wasn't at that time when I was doing my work on environmental racism that engaged in climate change, because I didn't really know where I fit. I mean, just like I didn't know where I fit with environmental racism, I more so didn't understand where I could fit with climate change, because I saw that as the domain of the climate scientist, which I am certainly not. So I didn't feel I had the right background to engage in climate change work. But I started reading articles about climate justice, and it spoke to me. And I realized, yes, I do fit. I'm not a climate scientist. I can't tell you too much about greenhouse gas emissions. I hear about it all the time. I don't know much about it, but what I do know is about justice and intersectionality and race and gender and class, all the things that sociologists are very good at, and colonialism, etc. And I thought, how can I use my kind of sociological background to maybe engage in this topic? And after reading all the articles about climate justice from the United States and a few from Canada, I thought, okay, let me see if I can do something. And I realized that, the Black community, for example, are not very engaged in the conversation about climate change. And how would I change that? They don't engage themselves in the conversation, perhaps because they don't see relevance. But I feel that NGOs don't engage Black communities. So I started doing work on climate change. I'm doing 2 projects right now, one in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, and another in Nova Scotia, where I'm engaging Black communities in climate change workshops. They're going very well. I'm very, very surprised about how engaged and excited Black community members are about this topic, because I really didn't think they would be. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that our workshop questionnaire brings relevance to them, and it's intersectional. It talks about race, gender, class, age, disability, but it also talks about food security and housing and flooding and all the things that have everything to do with climate change. And when you make those connections for people, then they say, okay, it's relevant to me. I think when you don't, they say, what does this have to do with me? Like many of us, not just Black people, but many of us, I don't understand what this has to do with me. I have other priorities in my life. So I said to myself, I need to make this relevant to the Black community. And I think our questionnaire has a lot to do with that, because the workshops in Nova Scotia and in the GTA have been overwhelmingly positive. They're loving it. And they're saying to us, we want more. And they're saying nobody ever selects us, right? So it's been really, really great. I also engage in environmental education and training. A lot of that is mentorship. Starting in Nova Scotia, I was kind of overwhelmed by the students in different departments who were coming to me to learn more about environmental racism, but also to volunteer. in various ways. Students from sociology, planning, the law school, environmental science, environmental studies, international development studies, political science, and on and on. I was like, what's happening here? Everybody has a stake in this issue, I guess. And now I understand it. The law students are interested in legislation. The health students are interested in the health impacts. The planning students are interested in the placement of industry in certain communities. I understand it now, but I also realized at that time, this is very interdisciplinary, environmental racism. And then that means the solutions must be interdisciplinary, just like any issue, not just environmental racism. So mentorship and providing students with opportunities to actually meet impacted communities. And that's what they really wanted. They're sitting in their environmental science class, hearing about Sabaganagadee First Nation, but never having met anybody from there. Because I had developed relationships with community members, I was able to provide the students with opportunities to go up to those communities and meet with them. So this has been great for me because it's a learning experience for me to be exposed to students in different departments and faculty in different departments. I'm also currently developing a kind of environmental curriculum project in Windsor, Essex, Ontario. We are engaging Black high school students in focus groups, in-person focus groups, to tell us about their curriculum and to what extent their curriculum and teaching resources reflect the experiences that Black folks in Windsor, Essex, and more broadly in Canada, the extent to which their experiences are incorporated into the curriculum. Yeah, so, but it's not just on environmental racism. I would say it's broader. So looking at environmental racism, climate change, and urban planning issues. To what extent are your experiences as Black folks in Windsor, Essex, incorporated into the curriculum and teaching resources? And then after we analyze the data, our plan is to connect with school board folks, superintendents, etc., to see whether or not some of the data that we collected can inform the curriculum. I know this is tough. Changing curriculum in Canada and elsewhere is extremely tough. People are accustomed to what they do. They teach in a particular way. It's hard to get them to change, but I'm going to try. Legal remedies have been also important. Eco-Justice, you've probably heard of. They have offices across Canada. I first connected with them in 2016 when I was doing that water testing project in Lincolnville. But in 2018, they opened up an office in Halifax when I was still living there. And I went down to the office. I met with the lawyers there, and I just wanted to share with them some of the communities I was working with, telling them about the issues. And yeah, since I met with them, yes, they're working with many of those communities. The information, of course, is private and confidential. I don't know what's happening. I can say that not Lincolnville, but Shelburne, they launched last year a human rights case, probably with the support of Eco-Justice, I think. They launched a human rights case, not just around environmental racism, but all other types of racism that the Black folks in South Shelburne have been experiencing over the years. So I'm very happy to hear that, because I said to Louise, the leader there, I said, when are you going to launch a class action lawsuit? Like, aren't you fed up? So it's nice to hear that they've done something like that. One of my babies is getting environmental racism legislation passed. I've been trying to do this since 2015 in collaboration with politician Lenore Zan. She was an MLA NDP in Nova Scotia. And we developed together. So much of it was based on my book. So I wrote a kind of 15-page report based on my book. I handed it to her. And because she had never really heard of environmental racism before we met once again in a coffee shop. And she said, why don't we develop a private members bill? I have to be honest with you, they never really pass into law. But what they're good at doing is giving attention to an issue. And then we can have a press conference, Ingrid, and we can do this and we can do that. And I thought to myself, that sounds great. Because when I met with her, I wasn't thinking about a bill. I just thought maybe a politician can help me. So since 2015, in 2015, we developed, January 2015, we co-developed this private members bill, Bill 111 in Nova Scotia. And she put it forward to first reading. She introduced it, and then it went to second reading, and it didn't pass. And she put it forward several years after that, up until 2018, perhaps, and it never passed. And then in 2020, just before COVID hit, in February 2020, she reached out to me and she said, remember that bill we developed? I said, yeah. She said, why don't we turn that into a federal bill? And I said, that would be great. We can deal with cases of environmental racism across Canada, specifically all the pipelines in Indigenous communities. And we changed the bill a bit. We made it a bit more robust. We're asking for disaggregated race-based data, statistical data, compensation, the link between race, income, socioeconomic status, and health. It's much more robust. We were playing it safe when we were in Nova Scotia because people didn't really know about environmental racism. So I do admit we were playing it very safe, but we're asking for more now. So it went through Parliament very successfully. And then, of course, you know that the snap election happened in 2021. When a snap election happens, everything gets wiped off the table. So this was horrible. And I said to Lenore, what now? We heard, though, that Elizabeth May was interested in reintroducing our bill. The bill, when Lenore had introduced it, was called Bill C-230. When Elizabeth May introduced it in February 2nd of 2022, it changed to C-226. It's the same bill with just a few amendments that Lenore Zan was asked to make when she was sponsoring the bill, but it's basically the same bill. It went through Parliament nicely, just like it did with Lenore, and I'm happy to say that right now it's sitting at Senate. So about a month ago, it was reviewed at second reading, and although the Conservative critic criticized heavily the bill, he said it was too broad in scope. He didn't feel that it was going to be tackled well. He said, but I do agree that it deserves a reading. It deserves a review. So I was really shocked because he was just attacking the bill. I was looking online on the video, and I'm saying to myself, this bill is not going to pass. Everybody's telling me it's going to pass. It's not going to pass because he just attacked it. And I was surprised when he said it does deserve a review. So right now we're waiting for spring, where it's going to be at third reading to see whether or not it passes. When it passes, it's called royal assent, and then it becomes law. So there's a high chance that this bill that Lenore and I developed back in 2015, we changed it a bit, will turn into the first environmental racism legislation / law in Canada. I hope that happens. And since then, I've been building national partnerships. I returned to Ontario to teach at McMaster in 2021. And I actually co-founded another organization. In addition to the Enrich Project, this organization is called the Canadian Coalition for Environmental and Climate Justice. I co-founded it with Nalo Charles, who resides in Toronto. We met online on Zoom in 2020. This is very exciting, this project. We've done so many things like send BIPOC youth to COP. We sent, so the first one was in Glasgow in 2021, and then 2022 was in Egypt. Also, part of what we do is kind of mentoring BIPOC youth, sending them to COP so they can gain skills and network. And right now, we are probably going to be leading the new National Environmental Justice Strategy with the Department of Environment, the Federal Department of Environment, which is extremely exciting. We learned about that recently. They were considering many other organizations, and we found out about 3 weeks ago that they have chosen our organization to do this because they feel that we are connected to BIPOC communities across Canada. This is a 3-part project that's going to include awareness raising about environmental racism in impacted communities, because just because they're impacted doesn't mean they understand what environmental racism is or even use that term. It's also going to include a study that's going to look at the connections between race, socioeconomic status, and health. And it includes consultations, which is actually primarily what my organization, CCECJ, will be leading. So we're going to do consultations probably on Zoom, online, across the country with impacted communities, probably selecting some NGOs to do that work. Obviously, Nalo and I cannot do that work by ourselves. So I think the process we're going to use is to pay some ENGOs and other civil society organizations to do much of that work. But we have received that contract from the Department of Environment, and hoping to start that work in the new year. This is extremely exciting. This is also something I wanted when I started the work on environmental racism way back. I wanted to be part of or to develop a national environmental justice strategy for Canada. This is the first ever, as you probably are aware of. I want to now talk quickly about the role of post-secondary institutions in issues of environmental racism. So I feel, of course, that post-secondary institutions can play a significant role in helping to address environmental racism in various ways. So given how interdisciplinary, as I said, the topic of environmental racism is, incorporating information about environmental racism into curricula and teaching in programs at universities such as environmental science, environmental studies, planning, sociology, law, political science, geography, health, and medicine would raise for me awareness about the issue and mobilize students on the issue, because students are the people who are most mobilized around climate change and environmental justice issues. Maybe that's happening, but from my perspective, it's not. Because I question why students at Dalhousie always came to me for work on environmental justice. Many of them would say to me, like in international development studies or environmental science, Ingrid, we're not learning about this. The stuff that you're doing with the Enrich project, we're not doing anything on that. You know, they wanted to know about colonialism. They wanted to learn about capitalism. They wanted to learn about racism. And many of them said to me, we're not learning about this in my classes. That's why I've come to you. So I can't speak for all of Canada, but I find that with many of these programs, they're not incorporating these issues, and they're not incorporating health issues. You know, I see this issue as very interdisciplinary. I don't think you can talk about environmental racism without talking about health. So because through the work that I've done over the years, I understand now the interdisciplinary nature of this. I understand that it belongs everywhere and anywhere. And I don't feel the programs that you're seeing on the screen here fully incorporate issues around environmental racism. So I think universities have a responsibility to do that. I also think that universities have a responsibility for supporting students in creating their own campaigns or in joining campaigns organized by NGOs in Canada and other organizations that are advocating on environmental justice. So I think there are certainly courses that are experiential, that are much more practical. You know, so as I said, students used to come to me at Dalhousie, but many of them came because they were in experiential courses and they needed to connect with an organization because, you know, they needed a few hours. And it would be great if that was supported a little bit more, and that more practical work, not just focusing on the curricula and articles and readings and academic work, but connecting the academic work to advocacy outside academia and supporting students in that. And students, when we see them connecting to organizations like whether it's David Suzuki Foundation or other NGOs, having professors and the university support that work and support campaigns that students would create on their own or support in collaboration with other organizations. I also think that, and this is not for selfish reasons, but I think there's a lack or dearth of environmental sociologists at Canadian institutions. You know, there's so many environmental science departments. Yes, that's important, but we need more environmental sociologists like Dr. Bullard, who I mentioned earlier, who defined environmental racism. What I do is environmental sociology, and the only way we're going to understand the connection between race, class, gender, capitalism, colonialism, settler colonialism is if we have more environmental sociologists. And I feel that just from what I've seen, Canadian universities are dominated by environmental scientists. Yes, understanding pollutants and contaminants and the science of it is important, but it's no more important than what an environmental sociologist can bring to this particular issue. In fact, I think only an environmental sociologist can adequately talk about environmental injustices and climate injustices, because I haven't seen that really so far. So we need universities to hire, I would say, much more or environmental sociologists or people working in the space of justice. To me, that's lacking at Canadian universities. And also moving beyond the focus on sustainability to a focus on environmental racism. So I find that a lot of universities talk about sustainability. They have sustainability departments. Sometimes when they invite me to do a talk, they want me to do a talk on sustainability. I say I don't do that. Yeah, environmental racism is, you know, embedded within the broad topic of sustainability. But for me, sustainability lacks that focus on power. You know, so that's why I say I don't do sustainability. It's, you know, when I look at how people understand it, when I look at what's being done, the issue of power should be central, and often is not. With environmental racism, there's no argument that the issue of power is central to environmental racism. The issue of racism and discrimination is central. And I feel with sustainability, those issues are often left out. So this kind of broad emphasis on sustainability for me is problematic, and we need to focus more on issues of power and naming this issue as what it is. It's environmental racism. So for me, those are some of my ideas in terms of what I think universities are responsible for doing. I want to conclude with a few final words, because I want to leave you with a bit of hope, because this is a very, it could be a very hopeless topic, but there's lots of hope based on what has happened over the past few years. So the legacy of struggle, oppression, and resistance against environmental racism in Canada has led to several wins in recent years. At the end of 2016, the South End Environmental and Justice Society, founded by members of the African Nova Scotian community in South Shelburne and their allies, succeeded in closing the dump. In addition, in the spring of 2020, Elliot Page gifted the community with a well, which is in the process of being installed. Last year, the organization brought their case to the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and they've had so many other wins that I don't have time to share with you. On January 31st, 2020, Northern Pulp Mill finally closed after the Nova Scotia government announced in 2019 that the mill had failed to produce an alternate plan for its wastewater treatment and ordered the mill to close then, which of course it did. In October 2021, 7 years after the project began, Alton Gas announced that they had decided to cancel the Alton Gas brine discharge pipeline project in Sabaganagati First Nation, stating that with the sale of the Nova Scotia utility, the repositioning of the business, and the challenging nature of the storage project economics, Alta Gas had decided not to continue with the development of Alton and to move forward with decommissioning the project. Next, while the former residents and descendants of Africville have yet to obtain redress, they continue to make demands for reparations. In November 2016, up to 300 former residents of Africville and their descendants joined an application submitted to the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia for a class action lawsuit against the city of Halifax over the loss of their land 4 decades ago. The application was turned down by the judge in 2018, who ruled that the plaintiff had not satisfied the requirements to certify the class action, preventing the case from proceeding. Africville descendants continued to fight, however, and to make their voices heard. In 2020, they marched through the streets of Halifax, demanding reparations at all levels of government. And a few years ago, a podcast series was launched titled Africville Forever. If you're interested in learning more about the issue or the concerns that Africville folks have around gentrification that happened and environmental racism. I'm pretty sure, however, with Africville, they keep rising up every few years, so we haven't heard the last of Africville. But right now, I would say in terms of the communities I've looked at, it's the only one that has yet to get redress, which I think certainly will change in the next few years. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. And that's it. I'm exhausted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Waldron. I know that there was a lot shared in your presentation and a lot that aligned with some of the questions that were coming in as well. And I know we only have a few minutes for a little bit of Q&A with our audience. So I'm going to jump right into the conversation. And I want to thank folks for sharing their questions in the chat. We're going to try as much as we can to get as much questions as we can with Dr. Waldron today. And I know within your talk, you really focused in on delving deeper into this topic and term of environmental racism, which seems to be more widely known as a framework in the United States than in Canada, and recognizing some of the sort of situations that are happening in America when it comes to corporate dumping in Mexico and other issues as well. So just wanting to get a sense from you, Dr. Waldron, in terms of what factors may contribute to the lack of awareness of the framework related to environmental racism in Canada overall. I know you sort of alluded to this a little bit, but just wanting to see if you can delve deeper a little bit into that.
Well, I think the first issue that I kind of discovered when I started doing the work is that the term environmental justice is used in Canada rather than environmental racism. And when you use the term environmental justice, you assume that there's justice. And when it's used interchangeably for environmental racism, or when it's used in place of environmental racism, it's impossible for you to get to the issue of environmental racism, because there's no centering of race. When we talk about environmental justice, we assume that there is justice. And I often say that before we get to justice, and justice would be the tools that you would use to get justice, like legislation, you have to talk about the problem. So it's very similar to the fact that if you go to the doctor, you're not going to take the medication or the prescription until the doctor diagnoses you. The doctor has to diagnose you with the illness before you take the medication. In the case of environmental racism, in Canada, I felt that there was no diagnosing of the problem. So you can't get to the justice and to identify the tools that would achieve justice unless you figure out what the problem is. And if the problem is about colonialism and capitalism, if it is about racism, if it is about social class, education, and where people live, then that needs to be explored fully. But when I started in the project and I look at Canadian literature by mostly white environmental professors, the use of environmental justice was being used, and no one was talking about environmental racism. So for me, it's like, well, we first have to talk about the racism and get deep into that. Like, what is it? What's causing it? Is it racism? What else is it is causing this issue? And then we talk about the justice, and the justice can be many things. You know, as I said, it could be legislation, it could be education, it could be activism. So I think for decades, environmental justice was the concept that was being used. And that excludes anyone from kind of fully excavating the issue of environmental racism. Secondly, I think in Canada in general, of course, we know that there's a hesitance to talk about race, systemic racism. If we talk about race, it's often about the overt forms of racism. People get that. But the subtleties of environmental racism is hard to understand. I understand that because I didn't get it in the beginning, as I said. I didn't understand how the environment would be racist. So as I said, it all comes through policy. So I think the hesitance in Canada, or the refusal to center race in what is happening in Canada, is another reason why people haven't fully engaged in the issue. The other reason I think is that, you know, people often say that white people have hijacked the environmental justice movement. Back in 1991, Robert Bullard was there. There was a convening of different environmental justice activists in Washington, D.C., and they laid out 17 principles around environmental justice. This was a movement that was a movement of people of color and Black people. And what I've seen over the years is that white people have kind of hijacked the movement. It's become very, very whitewashed. So when that happens, I think there's less of an opportunity to talk about critical issues like racism. So, and I also think that when we talk, and there's no problem with this, but when we talk about environmental justice issues, we're talking about wildlife and conservation, like all important issues, but prevents us from talking about people, and the people who are impacted, the people who tend to be BIPOC folks are most impacted. So I would say those 3 or 4 factors play a role.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I'm mindful we're sort of nearing the end of our event, and I want to thank folks who've joined us for the event thus far. Also want to invite folks to share their feedback on the event today with the link in the chat. And if I could squeeze in one final question for you, Dr. Waldron, just for 30 seconds or so, wanting to just ask you in terms of what keeps you inspired to continue the work that you do, what brings you joy, and what's next for you in the research and the work that you are engaging in.
Keeps me going has been students, actually, and young people. So often I get tired. It's tiring. I think with climate justice, environmental racism, it's slow going, and that's why people get burned out. You know, you reach a certain point where you've advanced, but the progress is slow. But keeps me going is young people, because they're so enthusiastic. I'm surrounded by young people because, of course, as I said, they're the ones most mobilized on these issues. So that keeps me going. I also think this is just really interesting. I didn't think that in the beginning, but as I said, it's interdisciplinary. I've been able to meet people in different organizations, different disciplines, students. Like, it's the amount of people that I've met who have inspired me, who are part of my project, that keeps me going. I always reach a new plateau, and then something happens. Somebody says to me, "Oh, have you thought about this?" You know, I think what keeps me going is the fact that I say yes. I say yes People say, Dr. Waldron, can I meet with you in your office? Yes. They come into my office and they show me another way. They said, just like the hydrogeologist. So they would say to me, have you thought of this? I love what you're doing, but have you thought of this? And I think to myself, I haven't thought of this. Maybe I should do that. And then I'm on another path. In terms of what I'm doing, the National Environmental Justice Strategy, I'm excited about leading that with the Department of Environment. I think I've gotten into climate change so much more now. Right now, most of my projects are climate change. I want to do more of that. I want to do more around urban planning issues. I want to make, just like my hero, Dr. Bullard, who does housing, climate change, environmental racism, transit, like that's a role. He's a role model for me because he understands that these are intersecting issues. So I kind of want to be like him. I don't want to stay within my lane necessarily. I think I have something to offer. I'm not as I said, I'm not an expert on climate change. I don't see myself, but I have the ability to see these intersections. So I want to kind of follow some of my role models as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Waldron. Thank you for the gems that you shared in the presentation, some really tangible strategies and tools that folks from many sectors, not only in the post-secondary space, can take with them as we think about how do we really advance this work around addressing environmental racism. So I really just want to thank you on behalf of the University of Toronto and the planning team. Want to thank folks who have joined us for the event and the folks who are still with us. Again, we welcome your feedback and the link is in the chat. You're also welcome to scan the QR code on the slide to be able to share your feedback on the event. But we really just want to say thank you for joining us this morning for today's conversation. And again, a thanks to Dr. Waldron. Also wanting to share a thanks to our interpreters who are in the space who provided support for us and our captioner as well. Thank you for being a part of our event and providing support, and wishing everyone a good rest of day as well.
Thank you very much.